Thank you all very much for being here, and it's a pleasure to be in Ashland, where I spent 4 happy years going to. It was State College, Southern Oregon State College, but now I'm so glad it's now Southern Oregon University. Had a superb physics and math department then, and I believe it will have another physics department now. But anyway, the title of my talk is Mars, Mediocrity, and Fermi's Paradox. But we have a lot to cover in the cosmos. I'll introduce myself just very briefly, and then the cosmos and antiquity, what we gain from our ancestors' accounts of contact with the cosmos. SETI and mediocrity, I'll explain what mediocrity means in this context. Mars, the planet Mars is the catalyst of enlightenment. A very amazing discovery, kind of metaphysical one that I made, and I'm very fond of the term metaphysics, by the way. I'm a physicist who believes in metaphysics. Mars is the home of past life. Cydonia Mensa and Galaxis Chaos on Mars, 2 locations of what appears to be eroded archeology. Evidence of a terrible tragedy on Mars. Mars used to be Earth-like, and it's not anymore. Then we'll talk about the implications of this for Fermi's paradox. The fact that the cosmos seems like a ghost town to us. Then I will talk about what I believe is the cosmic destiny of the human race. And then, of course, there'll be an epilogue. The cherry tree, that's a cherry tree, by the way, in full bloom. I grew up in Medford, Oregon. It shaped me. You guys probably know it as Smoggy Bottoms. That's what we called it. That's what everybody at SOC called it. SOC, S-O-C, was what they called it when I was going there. And because it's downhill, and it had a lot of mills, and it was, there was a lot of smoke down there because they burned sawdust in those days for fuel and for just waste. So I graduated from SOU in 1975 with BA in physics, and then I was honored to be able to get my PhD in plasma physics at Lawrence Livermore Lab, working on controlled fusion energy. And it was an extension campus of UC Davis. Now, plasmas are gas that is glowing and conducts electricity like a metal. And it's the aurora borealis, it's a lightning bolt. It's the sun and the stars are all made of plasma. Most of the universe, the matter in the universe that we can see, is made of plasma. And my career has been focused on fusion energy and then also using plasmas for space propulsion. I invented my own space plasma thruster, which is now flying in space. But physics at this level, friends, is a little bit like Hollywood. So they're flying this thing in space, and do they mention my name on the original patent? No. Brandenburg who? Anyway, and then my great assignment I felt in life as physics was to continue the Einstein quest for a way to unify the 2 long-range forces of nature, gravity and electromagnetism. And in plasma physics, doing plasma physics, I gained an insight to how to do that. It is not a theory of everything. It's a theory of some interesting stuff that may be very useful. If you're going to write a theory of everything, you should know about everything, and of course we can't. So I think that's a holy grail quest. In the middle of my scientific career, for reasons I'll discuss, I became distracted with the planet Mars from my other, and I'll tell you why. Briefly, I went through 2 terrible nuclear crises when I was working at government labs, and I saw morale collapse. Everyone thinking, we're doomed, so are our families. nothing will survive. And when you're working in a whole department where everyone feels that way, it really affects you. And anyway, I'll explain a little bit more about that later without going into great detail. Anyway, so I also write science fiction. It gives me ideas. But in working in Washington, D.C., I heard some interesting things around the coffee machine and the water cooler, working with the Pentagon and the various agencies. And so I wrote this novel. By the way, it's got 2 heroines, and they save the world. There. She grew up in San Diego in a rich family. She grew up in Cleveland. So anyway, they make a great pair. They work together. Everybody else fights at the network they're at, but they work together as allies, so they get a lot done. Anyway, and then later in life, after surviving all of this, they settle down, have children and everything, they raise them, and they're on Mars finally when the War of the Singularity happens. If you know what the singularity is, we can discuss it later. Yes, antiquity, the heavens and the earth. Humans, humus, same root word, were made of the dust of the earth. Not very exalted. Yet we're told we're only a little lower than the angels. We're still important. And I love this very succinct phrase from the Bhagavad Gita. I believe it's part 6, verse 2. Death and misery exists on all worlds in the cosmos. This is what the Bhagavad Gita says. And of course, here are some people meeting somebody from another dimension or an angel, however you want to interpret it. One of the other things that runs through all of these accounts of human contact with, say, non-terrestrials is their misbehavior. Here, hi, well, it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible. It says the sons of God saw that the daughters of earth were very beautiful and got together with them. And the children of these unions were great men about whom many legends are written, and women too. And if you believe that, that's sort of a garbled version of what happened, then we're all part ET. And here's part of the Greek legends. Hi, I'm the god Apollo. This is my pal Cupid. Dinner. And she says, so you're both inviting me to dinner? And here, come up and visit me on my spaceship. Anyway, now, some other stuff that was reported in the heavens. This is from Nuremberg in 1561. They reported what they didn't understand what happened, but it looked like a battle. And being Europeans, they had seen a lot of battles. And it was complete with strange objects in the sky. It went on for 2 hours. And things fell down flaming from the sky and hit the ground and exploded and burned up. And strange creatures were seen on the ground. It's all in the accounts. And people say, oh, it was a sundog. This is what skeptics, professional skeptics and debunkers, professional society of debunkers and skeptics says it was sundogs. It was an optical illusion, stuff falling from the sky and burning. And of course, we know all aware of the tales in the Bible of war in heaven and also in the Greek legends. I'm more familiar with those than Eastern traditions. But the heavens, even from antiquity, were not thought of as places where everything ran smoothly. Now, in the modern times, we have the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and that's nice because its first premise, first assumption is that other cosmic peoples exist. They're out there. The next assumption is a little bit more dubious because they say they all communicate by radio, which we'll be able to pick up And, you know, well, I'm sure they use radio occasionally, but they probably moved on to something better. And, and then also assumption is mediocrity. And the Asian American heroine in my novel about the UFO cover-up, a professor is explaining to her the term mediocrity in terms of study, and she says, "That's not a term we like to bandy about in my business," she says. But in our case, mediocrity means typicalness. Other people are like us. We are typical. We're surrounded by people who are like us in many ways, so we can understand them and they can understand us. And of course, here's a jam session. We understand that, and I've seen this great telescope array down in New Mexico. It's really quite spectacular. Now, mediocrity, what does that mean in a practical sense? Humans and their behavior seem typical of nature on Earth. Here's two of our relatives. So it's just sitting there in its food, says one, and the other one says, "Nah, looks too easy. Probably a net someplace or a trap. How would you like to grind a organ? Be an organ grinder monkey." No. So anyway, we seem typical of other intelligent and semi-intelligent species on Earth. And the assumption is that we're probably typical, that since the laws of physics are the same out in space, we're probably typical, and they eventually determine the laws of biology, we're probably typical or mediocre C students in the cosmos. One of the sayings I've heard in my career is, "Don't worry, John, God passes C students." So now, in a practical sense, what would the future of humanity look like if we live in a mediocre cosmos where people were basically friendly? Well, it's like Star Trek. Here's Captain Kirk is the only human being in this picture. Everybody else is from someplace else, but they look pretty much like us. And as if you watch it's one of my favorite Star Trek episodes from the early series, and they behave a little like us too. There's one great scene. It shows Spock, who's Vulcan, talking with one of these people. They're called Andorians. And he says, somebody tried to kill the captain with a knife on board. And it was one of those people. And he says, "Well, he's a member of my staff. He's always done his job adequately." And Spock says, "Well, it makes no logical sense that he would attack the captain." And Andorian says, "The universe does not run on logic." And this is one alien telling another one that. So I thought it was a great conversation. So anyway, now the planet Mars has played, the god of war, because of its red color, because of its red color and its movements across the sky. I mean, Mars varies in brightness probably more than any other object in the sky, because sometimes it's very close to us, sometimes it's very far away. Its orbit lies outside the Earth, unlike the morning star, which stays pretty close to the sun, or Mercury. It also has one of the most eccentric orbits of any planet in the solar system. It's not a circular orbit. It's kind of an oval shape. It's noticeably oval. So anyway, because of its bright red color and its association with war, kings would employ teams of astrologers. That was the money planet for astrologers. Tell me what Mars is doing this week so I know whether to attack my neighbor. And now, because the Copernican model came out, and he was very smart to make sure it was written in a book and published after his death, because he didn't want any trouble with the church. But Johannes Kepler studied his work, and in Copernicus' model, the solar system is based on circular orbits, all centered on the sun. And Kepler knew from observations just by eye very careful observations, that Mars was not moving on a circular orbit. And as I said, Mars was the money planet in those days. People wanted you to track Mars as closely as possible. So his local patron, a local warlord or something, was paying him to track Mars. So he says, well, I can do it very carefully if I work out this theory. So the orbit of Mars became his focus. And he worked out the laws of motion of the planets mathematically. Notice Mars is moving slower than the Earth. It's moving on its oval orbit, or looks like a circle displaced from the sun, but actually it's an oval with this one focus of the oval on the sun, an ellipse. And he worked out mathematically using rediscovered, it was the beginning of the Renaissance, he discovered all of this new Greek mathematics having to do with ellipses and all this Greek learning had suddenly become available in Europe. And also they had now this new system called Arabic numbers. So you could actually do math pretty well. Roman numerals were very hard to do good, complicated math with. You could basically add and subtract or multiply. But now you could do precise calculations using Arabic numerals and the Greek mathematics, which had been rediscovered. And so he worked out the laws of motion. He didn't understand why they moved the way. He thought it was magnetism. He knew that magnetism could affect things at a distance, but he didn't know why the planets would be magnetized or anything. But Isaac Newton figured it all out. He studied the work of Kepler very carefully. Once again, doing circular orbits around the sun. That's easy to do, easy to understand, because everything is constant. But the orbit of Mars changed everything. Things were changing all the time. So he had to invent calculus to understand the orbit of Mars. He had to understand the laws of motion and finally postulate a new force, the law of gravitation, which explained everything that he saw around him. You know, why do things drop? To why do the planets move in their courses? He was, so he published this great book called The Principles of Natural Philosophy, which had calculus, laws of motion, and the law of gravity all in there. And it changed the world. It completed the scientific revolution. In fact, a lot of people did not, even though the Copernican model had been around for 300 years, a lot of people still didn't believe it. I mean, we're talking scholars. But when Newton invented gravity, then they understood it and it all made sense. That's when the Copernican model of sun being the center of the solar system really became accepted. And he also worked on telescopes, interestingly enough. He was such an incredible genius. He figured out you could curve mirrors and use them instead of lenses. And curved mirrors, you could make them a lot bigger than big lenses. Lenses were hard to make because the glass making was not a very good art. You could make small lenses that were pretty good for glasses, but building big ones, that was hard. But you could make curved mirrors. And you could make telescopes that could gather a lot of light. And when they started looking at Mars, they realized, oh, it's got like polar caps, and it's got dust storms on it. It's like Earth. I mean, they could look at the moon, no polar caps, no dust storms, nothing. You're not dealing with people who have a lot of they like things to be simple. So they say, well, it's either moon-like or it's Earth-like. And Mars obviously fell in the Earth-like category. And of course, his law of gravity was immensely powerful to understand everything that they saw in the heavens. the King of France named himself the Sun King because everything moved around him, for instance. And one of the important things about Newton's law is it's the force between two bodies in space is the mass of one times the mass of the other divided by the distance squared between them times this constant called, we call it big G, Newton's gravitation constant. Probably the most important number in the universe. Now, as people got better looking at telescopes, Mars went from being an object of astrology to being an object of science. People went from being astrologers, which was where they had their grants from the government, to being astronomers. And this fellow, interestingly enough, he'd been visiting Japan, where its flag, even in those days, was a big red dot. And he came back obsessed with the planet Mars. And he'd been exposed to a very foreign culture, a very different culture. So he was very open to new ideas and new ways of looking at things. And then he was from a wealthy family, so he bought a superb large telescope that was for sale. And he bought some land at the top of a mountain in the middle of a desert, so he had the best sighted, biggest telescope on Earth. The combination of location and optics was the best on Earth. And he started studying Mars, and other people had reported what they thought were, they called them canali, which is in Italian just means channels. And this is translated, but believe it or not, the newspapers didn't have clickbait in those days, but they had headlines. And the headlines sold, so they said, canals found on Mars, when that's actually not what the Italian astronomer who named them canali actually meant. He meant just straight lines, basically. But anyway, Lowell started mapping what he thought were these lines on Mars. And he also named everything on Mars that he was seeing. And anyway, because of the canals, and you've got to realize they just finished the Suez Canal when he did this. And that had just electrified the world, because suddenly, instead of taking 2 months to get to India, between India and England, you could do it in a week because of the Suez Canal. It was a masterpiece of engineering. And it had opened, and they'd actually started on the Panama Canal, but that was a lot harder. But anyway, so they were obsessed with big canals in those days. So the canals on Mars meant intelligence. Maybe there's somebody up there intelligent who's kind of moving water around on the planet. It looks like a kind of desert planet, and they're moving water from the northern polar caps to the drier regions around the equator. So it all kind of made people think, oh, Mars is inhabited like Earth. And this is H.G. Wells was a very deep thinker. And he was part of the British Empire, which at that point controlled 1/4 of the world's population. And he knew how they maintained control, the British being the British. Would you like sugar in your tea? Oh yes, so we had to put down a revolt. Unpleasant business. We'll talk about it later. The British ran their empire like most empires were run. And he was aware of that. And he was aware of what it meant to conquer people and take their resources and everything. So he said, well, maybe Britain will get the law of karma will come back to haunt England. So he wrote, 2 years after Lowell's book on Mars and the canals, he writes War of the Worlds, which had laser beams and poison gas, which was then used in World War I. Now, Goddard absorbed all this stuff from Lowell and also H.G. Wells. He wanted to go to Mars. I want to go there, and he was climbing a cherry tree What made him think of Mars? I'm not sure. But he was climbing a cherry tree one day. This was a big moment for him. And suddenly he said, I want to go to Mars. And I want to invent some kind of anti-gravity device to go to Mars. Because everybody had rockets in those days. He knew what a rocket was. But he thought, no, rockets were for fireworks. He wanted anti-gravity. But after trying certain anti-gravity ideas that didn't work, he settled for a rocket using liquid fuel, which could go much faster according to the mathematics worked out by a Russian, Tsiolkovsky. So he launched his first liquid fuel rocket in 1926 in Massachusetts. It flew probably about 50 feet up in the air. And he got better and better at it, and he started working out all the mathematics to get to the moon. And then people started complaining about his rocket experiments because they were making so much noise. So he moved his entire operation he got a grant, and moved his entire operation in 1930 to a place where nothing ever happens. Roswell, New Mexico, in 1930. There he is actually taking one of his rockets to the test thing. He finally got rockets that went up like 5 miles. By the way, the Germans infiltrated his team of technicians and were passing everything he was learning to Germany, which had decided rockets would be the new super weapon for the next war. And so Roswell, a little backwards place in New Mexico, became a center of international intrigue as the shadow of World War II loomed over them all. And Einstein, who was a pacifist in Germany in World War I, commented in 1917, when World War II, people were freezing in the trenches in February 1917. He says, it's a pity that we do not live on Mars and can just observe man's nasty antics by telescope. He thought maybe Mars is a better place than Earth, where people are better behaved. But when the war ended, he suddenly became obsessed with unified field theory. His theory of gravity, which gave us black holes and the Big Bang and everything like this, said that gravity could bend light, which was electromagnetic radiation. So you could bend electromagnetism with gravity. The unified field theory suggested you could bend gravity with electromagnetism. You could alter gravity with electromagnetism. And that was his goal. He was a very practical guy. And he pursued that effort to do unified field. Later in his life, he commented, he was in the United States finally, commented, the US government has discouraged me from working on unified field theory. This was back in the 50s. I wonder why, he says. And this inspired me, well, actually, when I decided I wanted to become a physicist, my uncle, William Surrey, helped found the Sierra Club. He was a nuclear physicist at Berkeley. He worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project. He was my hero. My father was a medical doctor. So at 11 years old, I rushed up to my father, and he was painting a fence. He loved building things and painting them. He was painting this fence. He's wearing his old combat boots. He was a combat veteran from World War II. And I said, Dad, I want to be a physicist like Uncle Will. And he says, good, son. And then, good for you. And then I said, but I don't know what area to work on in physics. There's so many areas. Even in those days, I knew at 11 years old, I had studied it enough to know there were many different specialties. And he said, well, why don't you work on Einstein's unified field theory, he says. And he'd been a veterinarian's assistant when he was younger. And he says, if you're a dog, it's good to have a big bone to chew on, he says. And went back to painting his fence. And I just was, here's my pop, I'm 11 years old. So I wandered off and just sat under a tree and just thought, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do in life. And so through years and years of trying things, I actually came up with a theory. Because of plasma physics, we were trying to, I discovered an effect in plasma physics that looked just like gravity, but it was pure electromagnetism. And to make a long story short, the theory ended up yielding an estimate, a theoretical value for big G, the Newton gravitation constant, and it comes out to within a part per thousand. I went and presented this at a meeting with a bunch of string theory people. They paid me the ultimate compliment. They became angry with me. So enough. I'll answer more questions on it. But here's what the theory predicts. It predicts you can do anti-gravity. Okay, this is a coil with liquid metal contact, so it can't feel forces from the outside. And it's a coil on a very sensitive chemical scale. Now, see that plus sign? That means this is what's called, it's operating, the chemical scale is operating, it's for mixing up chemicals very carefully. And it's what's called tare mode, where it just, all it does is measures the difference in weight from before and after. Like if you put a glass of water there and some of it evaporated, it would get lighter. And that would show up as a negative sign. You can set it for tare, meaning changes, look at the changes of weight. So this one is slightly above, for some reason it's reading a slightly positive value. Okay, I'm going to turn it on. It's gone negative. It lost about 1% of its weight. So don't pack your bags for Mars just yet. We can do this thing if we can make it lose 1% of its weight. And we repeated this experiment more and more carefully. For one thing, we separated the coil from the weighing device by a nylon thread, so there was no way the electromagnetic fields could interfere with the weighing apparatus, and it did the same thing. Now, my theory may not be the final correct theory. It's a stab in the dark, but because of this and because of big G, I know humanity can do this thing. Make our own flying saucers, buzzing around the galaxy without rocket fuel. I know we can do it now. All we have to do is get $1 billion someplace to develop this further. Where could I find? Well, by the way, the government gave me money to explore this theory and try and make it as streamlined and nice, as elegant as possible, the mathematics and everything. They gave me $200,000 to explore this theory further. This is DARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Administration. And they only said one thing: don't do any experiments. And I said, okay, just please sign my check. Yeah, they told me, don't do any experiments, just do theory. So I said, okay. We'd already done this experiment. So I technically was not, so I can talk about this because we already did it. So anyway, yeah, I got the implication that if I did an experiment, I might get a one-way bus ticket to Site 51, and they wouldn't let me out. So I didn't want that, of course. So, but anyway, now, after Einstein had done all this stuff, and he was talking about unified field theory for years, and all of this stuff was digested by a fellow named Edward Smith. He had a PhD. It wasn't in physics, it was in food science. But he liked the sound of the PhD. And he suddenly got this great vision of the future where humanity was part of a galactic federation of enlightened peoples, some very humanoid, some not. Humanity was depicted as very successful and spread out on the stars and colonies, you know, in peace with the other people. And it had warp drive, laser weapons, nuclear weapons, big powerful starships. It also had evil space pirates. And it had a planet that was very dangerous, because of the life forms living there that was the source of this drug that everybody in the galaxy wanted. This planet was called Trenco. This was written in 1937. Where have we heard that? Just as a sign that things had changed, in Dune, instead of the Galactic Federation spending all this money and hardware trying to keep people from coming to this planet and stealing this drug from the plants, the plant life, in the Dune, of course, the galactic government runs the franchise to distribute the drug. So times have changed, but anyway, so Trenco actually became Arrakis. And the drug was called thionite, and of course it turned into spice. In Galactic Patrol, it was highly illegal. But their main problem was this pirate organization, like the Barbary Pirates, was raiding all the interstellar shipping, and this was causing everybody to get upset. And kind of like people launching missiles in the Red Sea right now. So yeah, the Galactic Patrol, which the humans contributed a lot of personnel to, was supposed to chase these pirates down and so that people could trade. Anyway, so that was his vision in 1937 in the shadow of the world. Everybody could see World War II is coming. And now, this inspired a whole science fiction genre: Star Trek, Star Wars, and Dune, from that one novel. And I read it when I was probably about 12. And it inspired me, because they had anti-gravity in it. Gravity was, they just turn it on and off like with a light switch in the Galactic Patrol. Doc Smith was not lazy as a food scientist. He invented the sugar donut. Before that, people had made a paste of sugar and pasted it on the donuts, but he put a special oil coating on the donut, so then you could just sprinkle the sugar on and sell it. Took less sugar and it was easier to make. So anyway, that was his great accomplishment as a food scientist. But no, he wrote what's called the Lensman series, which became the Jedi in Star Wars. Okay, now back to Mars, which was the inspiration for the idea of intelligent beings nearby that we could interact with. And Mars, as it turns out, we now know was once Earth-like. It once had an ocean. I discovered the ocean, but I don't get credit for it, just like my rocket thruster. Brandenburg who? You'll see why they don't give me any credit in a moment. Why I'm, as I said, radioactive on Mars. Mars has red soil like Earth. This is the Sahara Desert. What color is it? It's bright red. If you, God forbid, took away all the oceans and plant life on Earth, and everything was a desert, Earth would be the second red planet. And it's because of the oxygen combining with the iron in the soil to make what's called hematite, the same as hemoglobin. So Mars apparently had an oxygen atmosphere in the past. Now, so it was apparently a living planet like the Earth for most of its history. The ocean bed on Mars is in the north of Mars. Mars, just to give you a quick primer on Mars, Mars has a very ancient highlands that in the southern hemisphere that's all covered with craters and water channels, but it's very ancient. The north, the way you date things on Mars, you count how many craters per square mile. Then you go to the north, things look almost terrestrial. There's very few craters. And that's where the ocean is, the ocean bed. So that ocean survived for most of Mars' history. And you won't hear NASA talk about that either. I'll show you why. Mars has isotopes indicating a massive radiological event, a nuclear war, it looks like. Now, I worked in defense for a long time. I grew up in a rough town. I went working in defense. My father was a and all my uncles were combat veterans of World War II. It shapes one, and I recognize it limits one's perception. As one guy put it, he says, if your head is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you know? So I connect the dots the way best I know how. Other people are free to connect the dots other ways. But I'll just give you... Anyway, it looks like Mars became moon-like after this event, after this apparently thermonuclear war. Here's the old ocean basin. You can see here's lots of craters and then almost no craters. This is a place called Cydonia Mensa. It was the Vikings in 1976 were supposed to land there, but they decided instead to land them here. And this is another place called Galaxis Chaos. It was not named that originally. It was only named it after I made a discovery there. Okay, these look like two sites of possible archaeology on Mars. Both sit on apparently the shore of the ancient ocean. The pyramids of Elysium, by the way, if you're familiar with those, are down here on this area of land, what would have been land, dry land. Okay, here's Cydonia Mensa. This was taken in 1976 and electrified the world. What NASA did not like to show anyone in the pictures was this object. It's a pyramid. You have a face and a pyramid. It looks like Giza, abstractly like Giza in Egypt. A sphinx and a pyramid. They got two really good pictures of the face. They got three pictures of the pyramid, all from close orbit. The face looks distinctly unfriendly in the enhancements they did. That was in 1976, almost half a century ago. Here's a recent picture. You all heard probably that, oh, that's a dead issue. We took another picture. It doesn't look like a face anymore at all. Pyramids? There are no pyramids on Mars. This was taken in 2004. The face is there. Oh, by the way, notice the very circular crater there. And here's this, what appears to be a five-sided pyramid with this thing, appendage, pointing at the face. So NASA took a picture in 1998 and they released this to the public. We called this the cat box picture, as in a cat litter box, object in a cat litter box. They didn't enhance it, and they took it from an oblique angle so it looked as different from what everyone expected it would look like as possible. Notice the orbit, this crater doesn't look circular anymore because they're taking it from an angle from the side. This is what happens when you enhance it. Straight lines and what looks like two nostrils in the nose. It's got nostrils in the nose, and those, we had a 3D model from the Vikings, and we rotated it. We stretched this image across that 3D model and rotated it so we could see it looks like the Lion Man from Wizard of Oz. These are two other pictures, both confirming the nostrils. And look at the straight lines. Here's the straight lines, and there's a straight line where the helmet, what looks like the helmet joins the visor on the helmet. It's just like this Olmec head. And here's more pictures of the face. It still looks like a face. It's one of these things of, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I'm sorry, friends. The U.S. government is not just engaged in a UFO cover-up. It's engaged in a Mars cover-up also. It's an ET cover-up. They're trying to cover up the whole night sky. And that's impossible, of course. That's going to fall apart, as it does in my science fiction novel, because of two women. Two nosy women. They happen to be news anchors. That's our job. And but anyway, here's the detail on the pyramid. It looks like a doorway on the pyramid. Actually, no, it's a place where a bunch of brickwork has let loose and left a square missing part. This is a picture from one day, and this is from a picture from a different orbit. You can see it's a square missing piece of masonry. So I myself was part of this investigation, and I will make a confession. I am the clueless tool of a faction in the U.S. government that apparently wants the UFO cover-up to end. I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't even realize there was a UFO cover-up at the time. I was told in graduate school, there are no such things as UFOs, John. The world is flat. Stay away from the edges. And I said, yes, sir. Please sign my thesis so I can get out of here and get a real job and buy my wife a nice house, which I did. But you are basically, when you're part of the, especially if you're a graduate student, you're told what to think and not to ask questions. Not if you want to finish here, John. And so I ordered pictures sight unseen from what's now called Galaxis Chaos. It looks like, this is a watermark on the lens, that's nothing. But it looks like on this kind of elevated area, here's ocean, the ocean shoreline, and here is what looks like ruins with streets, and here is another face. And here's another one. And it was kind of spooky, by the way. I was laying down, the pictures had arrived. I was laying them down in my living room, and I felt like somebody was leaning over my shoulder saying, look down right now. And that's when I saw these two. And if you compare this face is only about 2/3 the size of this, so it isn't as resolved as well. In the Viking pictures, I'm going to show you new pictures of it. But it has the same markings over the eye, left eye, the same mark on the cheek. This is Cydonia. This is Galaxis Chaos. And here's the new picture of it. Now they've also taken a new picture even closer with a thing called Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. There's parallel plates by the nose, and there's the two eyes. So what's interesting is I made it known that we'd found these new objects at this place. It was called Utopia in those days. And this apparently caused a lot of fuss. Carl Sagan called me and said, why are you causing this trouble? And I said, well, Carl, I mean, you talked about the pyramids of Elysium in your thing, Cosmos, which I enjoyed very much. I mean, we're just investigating. He says, well, I said, we even found some new stuff. He says, yes, I heard about that. Could you send me some pictures of that? And I said, sure. So I had some pictures. I put them in an envelope. I said, where do you want me? He says, Planetary Science Department, Cornell University, Carl Sagan. And I took it to the mailbox, and the mail truck came by and picked it up. And so I then left my job at the government lab and went to Washington, D.C. to work for a defense contractor called Mission Research Corporation, very fine outfit. And one of the first things I did when I got there was I called his office and said, did you get the pictures? And in those days, we didn't have cell phones, so it was telephone tag, we called it. So he wasn't there. So I said, oh, well. So then I'm going out, coming back because we're doing marketing expeditions. It's the Reagan Arms buildup. All you had to do was go outside with a hat, and we could gather money falling from the sky. Where did the money come from? We're still not sure. But anyway, I would come back to the office and the lady said, Carl Sagan called for you. But I told him you were gone and we'd be back later. So then I'd call him and he was always gone. This went on for 2 weeks. Finally, I'm talking to my boss in my boss's office. And the office manager comes in and says, John has a phone call. My boss just glares at her like, why are you disturbing us? We're trying to sell something to the Naval Research Lab. And she says, it's from Carl Sagan. And he's snippy. And my boss just looked at me with big eyes. And he says, well, I guess you better take the call, John. So I went to my office and got on the phone with Carl Sagan. I said, well, Carl, what did you think of the pictures? And I had the pictures comparing the face of Cydonia with the face of Utopia, And he says, I never got them. And there was this long moment of silence. And I said, okay, I'll give you the frame number. I'll give you the photograph numbers, location on Mars. You can find it for yourself. And he got, so he got back to me later and said, these aren't as impressive as the first one. I said, well, I'm sorry. But somebody apparently intercepted our pictures, and that's the only thing I can think of. So anyway, then they named the place Galaxis Chaos after this episode. And I thought, somebody's galaxy has been thrown into chaos by these pictures. So I was happy. Now, Mars used to look like this. It looks like this now. And it happened in recent geologic time, meaning like before the dinosaurs, apparently, on Earth. Now, Mars has very curious isotopes. Isotopes are, it's a different number of neutrons and xenon is a very heavy gas. It's an inert gas like helium. It doesn't combine or anything, but it has very interesting properties. So they use it in like flash bulbs, things like that. But it has several dissonant isotopes. On Earth and everywhere else in the solar system, the amount of xenon-129, xenon atomic weight 129 in EMU, is the same as xenon-132. The two are almost even Steven. But on Mars, there's 2.5 times more. And I worked at a nuclear weapons lab. And somebody looked at this graph and said, somebody nuked them. And I was horrified. And I said, how? And he said, I can't tell you. He said, I shouldn't have said that. And he just walked away, wouldn't talk to me anymore about it. So and when you work in that kind of environment, you realize there's certain forbidden questions. You're getting out, you don't have need to know for certain programs. So anyway, he was part of the team that monitored the atmosphere on Earth for nuclear weapons explosions. So as it turns out, after half a century since they first detected this strange isotopic pattern on Mars, they still can't explain it. The only thing that explains it is what's called an R process event. R meaning rapid. Rapid and violent. These are the only two known R process events. Supernovas and thermonuclear explosions. And I found that in the open literature. So there were apparently two massive thermonuclear explosions. This is thorium map, and these are radioactive elements. So they're reading the gamma rays. There you go, ray, gamma. Gamma rays from space. I mean, they're orbiting Mars. The atmosphere is so thin, the gamma rays come out right up from the surface. So these are from radioactive potassium. These are from radioactive thorium. They stay radioactive for billions of years. So they have a long memory, especially potassium. If it gets irradiated with neutrons, it stays radioactive for 1 billion years. Thorium, there is no stable isotope. It's always radioactive. But potassium can stand out, first be non-radioactive and then become radioactive. So these are residual spots, and then there's, on the other side of the planet from these, there's another hot spot, which is apparently shock waves wrapping around the planet and depositing radioactive debris when the shock wave collided with itself on the far side of the planet. This is 0, and this is 180 on the other side of the planet and down in the southern hemisphere. So it's hard to digest, but apparently, and like I said, when your head is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But it looks like somebody dropped hydrogen bombs from space. There are no craters at these sites. There's nothing. It's flat. The only thing we find is trinitite, glass, like from nuclear explosions, especially at this place, which is near where the face on Mars is. It looks like somebody dropped 2 nuclear weapons onto Mars that were as big as the Empire State Building from space. Now, the explosions were so powerful they may have ignited the nitrogen in the Mars atmosphere. That was a fear they had in Oppenheimer when they were going to set off the first nuclear bomb. Explosions apparently blew most of Mars' atmosphere and space. They had 10 times the energy of the Chicxulub impact that wiped out the dinosaurs on Earth, and Mars is only half the size of the Earth, so it was much more powerful if you were standing on a spot on Mars. So that's very troubling. This leads us to Fermi's paradox. For a little comic relief, scientists sit there in their offices and think of how the universe ought to be. And then they talk to astronomers who actually tell them the way it is. And life on Earth is noisy. Especially the more intelligent you are, believe it or not, the more brainless noise you make. And so our expectation was that if we were not alone in the universe, we'd point our radio telescope to every place and get soap commercials, political campaign ads, and various, if you have a spoon near your ear and bang on it with another spoon, you can cure deafness, stuff like this, that should be bombarding us from every place. Instead, there's nothing. It's like we're in a ghost town. So that's our expectation, and this is our experience. So it's like the old westerns where the cowboys are sitting around the campfire and they say, "It's quiet tonight." And the other one says, "Yeah, it's too quiet." So the metaphysical question, this is true metaphysics, the extension of physics to a philosophical understanding. As above, so below. Are Earth and humanity an aberration on the cosmos, or are we a reflection of its nature? And I'm not going to tell you I know the answer, because I don't. All I know is what the voices of antiquity say. The data from Mars says things, and the reports from the UFO community say some things. So I'll just leave it at that. With that point, I'll leave you with that question. So, what do I think is the cosmic destiny of the human race? We will, in the end, it'll be a little difficult, join an enlightened galactic community of peoples that I believe that with all my heart. And we will get through this. We will get through this transition of going from being masters of the only living oasis in the whole universe to being just a speck of dust. But there's a few fascinating things about us. We may not be quite your average speck of dust. The galaxy has these arms, and there are two arms close to each other, and then there's an arm that connects the two arms. And we're right in the middle of that bridge. I'll show you something else. We are in the almost exact center of a great bubble in interstellar space. All the familiar stars are there, but there's a wall of stars all the way around us. And we seem to be almost the exact center of it, which it's like we're in, to use an analogy from Star, it's like we're in the center of the Romulan neutral zone. And if you believe, I complained to a ufologist friend of mine, I said, problem with ufology, there are no facts, there are only reports. But it is reported that we get visited by a whole bunch of different people. Some of them don't get along with each other, apparently, also. As above, so below, perhaps. But that would make sense if we're sort of somehow sitting on Boardwalk and Park Place. That we're the center of attention because we're in the center of this neutral zone. And everyone's traveling here freely because no one owns this part of space. Nobody. The Klingons don't own it. The Romulans. Nobody owns it. So, anyway, let us be optimistic. God said to Abraham was moping around his tent. He says, look, I'm an old man. You said I was going to have all these children, and I haven't got any children. And my wife's old too. What the hell? And God says to him, come outside. And he says, look at the stars if you can count them. So shall your seed be. And I believe he's speaking, there's a little bit of Abraham in all of us. So, I believe in my heart, all my heart, this is going to be what the future of humanity resembles. And we should boldly go to meet that future. We should accept the fact that we're not alone in the universe. No, we're not the most advanced. We're not the most this or the most that. But we are here. Yes, we're just a speck of dust, but so is everybody else. If you look at the maps of galaxies, like galaxies like in a snowstorm, snowflakes in a snowstorm, and you think, I used to ask my students in this one astronomy course I taught, suppose you were empress or emperor of one of these galaxies. Wouldn't that make you important, though? So even being a master of a galaxy would make you nothing, a speck of dust, compared to the universe as a whole. So I believe we should go up to Mars, find out what happened up there, make sure it doesn't happen here, especially we don't want to do that to ourselves. And first Mars and the stars, we can do this thing. And as proof, you guys are all sitting here. You're listening to this. None of you run out of the room screaming. No, you're willing to countenance these concepts. So thank you all very much. And I certainly have time for questions. I ended it just about the right time. Amazing. Sometimes I amaze even myself. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes.
So Graham Hancock wrote a book
Yes.
some years ago on Mars, and he had a theory of I don't know if it was you call it theory, but
Yes,
it appeared to
it's
be
all
that there
theory
was-
at this point.
Okay. that there was a great,
hypothesis, you know.
yeah, that there was a great flood that was basically virtually global, at least on one side of it. And I'm wondering how that might connect in with this glass fusion and other things that may have happened.
It's very interesting. I'm certainly aware of Graham Hancock. I know he's got a reputation for being a very smart fellow. Unfortunately, I haven't read that book, but I will definitely look at it. Mars shows all sorts of evidence for catastrophic flooding. There are places where it looks like whole regions suddenly disintegrated and released all this water to flow down into the ocean basin. It's very strange. You have craters that obviously were lakes and have river channels going out of them that turn into river deltas going into the ocean. I presented that picture, one of those pictures, at the very first time I presented. I presented to a group of 1,000 scientists my Mars paleo-ocean theory in 1987. Now it's fully accepted, but you don't ever hear them talk about me. Brandenburg who? And it's because of Cydonia. Cydonia. If we give Brandenburg any credit for the paleo-ocean, next he'll be claiming that there were people sailing in boats on this ocean. Yes?
Mars doesn't have a magnetic field, is that correct?
No, it doesn't have apparently the core is frozen.
So,
But what happens is the solar wind, interestingly enough, hits Mars. Same thing happens. Venus doesn't have a magnetic field either. But when the solar wind hits Mars and hits Venus, it generates a magnetic field. It's kind of a dynamo action thing. And so they kept saying, oh, Mars lost its atmosphere not all at once in some big catastrophic, but because of it got eroded away by the solar wind. It was blown away. And then they measured the amount would be 1,000th of an atmosphere, you know, in all of its history. So and what it is when the solar wind hits, it generates a magnetic field, which then traps atmosphere. And that's why Venus has a very dense atmosphere. It's closer to the sun. I should ask a scientist that.
if you don't have a magnetic field, what's there to protect you from solar radiation? Cosmic radiation.
With cosmic rays, yes, the radiation environment on the surface of Mars is more intense than it is on Earth. So Mars colonists will basically live in kind of underground shopping malls kind of things, and they'll be able to go up to where there are domes where there's just water, you know,
How could
shielding them.
How could you have life there without a magnetic field in the past?
Oh, well, it had, it's apparent that Mars did have a strong magnetic field at one point because they find big islands of magnetism on Mars. If you look at a magnetic map, especially the southern part of Mars, it's an ancient part of Mars, it has strong regions of magnetic field where apparently Mars had a very strong magnetic field when it was younger. But it's a smaller planet, so apparently its core ran out of liquid, its core solidified, and that's what caused, you know, the liquid core of the Earth causes magnetism. And I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, you did.
I wasn't there. I don't, but there's bacteria on Earth that like to live in the center of nuclear reactors. So life will find as they said in the Jurassic Park, life will find a way. And on Mars, they claim this is a puzzle. We're not sure what this means. It turns out in the summer and spring, the oxygen levels on Mars actually rise, and so does the methane level. And then in the fall, it declines, in the winter, it drops to zero. And then, so Mars is breathing. And they say, we don't understand why this is happening. And I said, well, there's obviously microbes in the soil making methane, and photosynthesis, they're making oxygen. Turns out the color of, if you go to the Oregon coast and look at the seaweed, the kelp washing up on the beach, what color is it? It's red. Because red absorbs blue light and green light much better. On Earth, green light is where the solar spectrum peaks, and for some reason, chlorophyll on Earth likes to reject that. It doesn't want all of that energy. So instead, it absorbs mostly red light and kind of bluish light and rejects the green. So that's why everything is green. But in places where there's not as much light, like 10 feet down in the ocean, the plant life changes its chlorophyll, becomes red. So when we look out in the red landscape of Mars, we may be just looking at, plant life clinging to all the rocks, and of course not recognizing it. By the way, they landed on Mars a half century ago and tested for life. They got weird results. They've now landed on Mars 5 times. Have they tested for life again? No. No. They haven't tested for life, even with new advanced technologies. Why is that? Do they already know the answer? They're afraid if they tell people. When I found evidence for this life on Mars, I was near the coffee machine, and some of my buddies had come up. We were on a coffee break, other physicists and scientists, technicians. And I said, "We got dead algae from Mars. Don't nobody panic." And a character in my science fiction book about the UFO, a cover-up collapsing because of 2 nosy women, says one of the women talks to this one guy who's from inside the government, and he says, and they find out there's a Mars cover-up, and she says, "Why are they covering up stuff at Mars?" He says, "Because the Mars bone is connected to the UFO bone." As the Mars bone goes, the UFO bone goes. And if the UFO bone goes, the head of this government will fall off, he says. So the 2 women are standing there and they look at each other. Whoa. Yes?
Yeah, so you indicated that the northern part of the planet was where the oceans were at.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Here, let me...
if you could go to the potassium.
Yeah.
There we go, yeah. And then you also indicated that you postulated that the 2 signatures there would be associated with radioactive emissions from a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, right?
Yes.
So I'm just curious, so is the argument or the idea that you're hypothesizing that these 2 weapon systems were dropped over the oceans, not actually over the civilizations?
No, they were the prevailing Cydonia Mensa is here. Galaxis Chaos is here. They're both to the northwest. The prevailing winds carrying all the fallout, and the strongest shock waves go along with would have hit the 2 areas. Not only that, the explosions were apparently so powerful that having an ocean there made no difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the whole point I was trying to get at is you also mentioned natural disasters, so you could have actually
Tidal
weapons,
waves as tall as
weapons
100-story
waves,
buildings,
right?
yes.
Yeah. So I had a second question for you. Had to do with your SETI comments.
Yes.
So and this isn't to knock your curiosity with gravity and its relationship to
Oh,
the
no,
electromagnetic spectrum.
please knock it around, knock it around.
Well, couldn't
I've been knocked around by people with gray beards.
Right. Cool. Well, you gotta watch
I
out
mean,
for
I
the younger
gave
guys.
this one presentation, and this guy was looking at all my view graphs, and I said, "Sir, I can walk you through this thing since you weren't here for the talk." And he says, "No, I can read it for myself."
Nice.
Fortunately, my girlfriend was standing by, otherwise I think he would have slugged me. And so, yeah, science in the big leagues, by the way, it's like professional basketball. It's not supposed to be a contact sport. But under the net, in a close game for a championship, the knees and elbows fly.
So my question.
Yes,
for you
I'm
is,
sorry.
couldn't we consider the electromagnetic spectrum possibly to be a mediocre intelligence spectrum? Right, or signal? I mean, it's something that we know, right? But if you think of like Hal Puthoff's ultra-terrestrials theory.
Hal Puthoff, he's one of my heroes.
Right.
His theory and my theory basically agree.
Right.
I asked him, I said, Hal, have you read my latest stuff? And he says, John, I read everything you publish. And you know, he's more on the inside of this thing than I am.
Right.
I'm just a clueless tool of the government. He's a tool of the government, but he's not as clueless as I am. But no, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. Oh, by the way, he read my novel, and he's Russian American. He called it War and Peace. Great compliment to me. It's long. Yes.
So I guess my point though is that if part of possibly the reason that we aren't really reached out to is because we aren't capable of communicating across the same spectrum, the signals intelligence or signal spectrum.
Yeah, it's when I said the SETI people think everybody communicates by radio or meaning electromagnetic. You know, that's a very dubious assumption. I believe that there are, you know, they use subspace communication, like in Star Trek, you know, which goes faster than light. But, you know, they have this quantum interference experiments where they measure the spin on one photon. Two photons come from the same event. They're entangled. They set up things, and they measure one, and it apparently changes the measurement on the other side of the room instantaneously. There's no time lag. So nature does have apparently an instantaneous. Well, look at all the constants. Why is the constant of the electron constant, you know, the electron mass and charge, the same here as in these far galaxies? Oh, the cosmic background radiation, you know, the microwave radiation, those things are supposedly from the original fireball of the Big Bang, which I tend to believe is a nice simple model. And these two photons meet each other and shake hands, and they're the same temperature. And yet they've never met. It's like they're identical twins, and yet they can't have ever met. And that is just standard science. But one of the things I want to make a confession from my tribe of scientists. If they don't understand something, they only want to talk about it. They don't like to talk about stuff they understand really well and publish papers on it.
Is there any place else in the solar system where these isotopes may have been measured higher?
Oh, yeah,
besides
some
Mars?
occasional meteorites. There's one meteorite where, you know, this big spike in Xeno 129, but it dates from the beginning of the solar system. It apparently got its isotopes from a supernova before the solar system even formed. It's got a great name, it's Allende. It fell in a place in Mexico called Allende. Not only did it have the weird isotopes, which they then ascribed to a supernova explosion, but it was full of organic matter, amino acids, all this. That stuff predates life on Earth. So it's all very exciting, guys. We have to have a positive viewpoint. Try and be positive about this stuff. Okay. Some bad stuff happened on Mars. Bad stuff has happened on Earth, but we're here discussing all of this here in Ashland, Oregon, a center of enlightenment in the world. You know, I don't know, maybe other places are more enlightened, but this was a good place. And so light has triumphed over darkness for the most part on this planet, and I believe the same thing has happened elsewhere. But I don't know. Yes?
You indicated that the nuclear bomb was dropped from space.
Yes, it looks
Does
like.
that preclude, I mean, I guess I always thought that the beings on the planet destroyed the planet.
It could be,
So that doesn't.
that's certainly a scenario we're familiar with
Yeah.
as being possible on this planet.
So, and dropping from space doesn't preclude it
Well-
being on the planet?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
I will be the first to say, please. I don't know what happened up there. I don't. I just connect the dots the best way I can. And I think we should go up there and find out what happened. And I believe the government should be forthright with us and explain to us what they are actually dealing with. I can understand why they decided not to tell everybody about this stuff when they first, but they've known about it for a long time. They measured the xenon 129 a half century ago, and they've never been able to explain it. I've got papers from just last year where just called a mystery. It's a mystery. But there's a nice science fiction movie called The Mysterians, made by the same Japanese outfit and director that gave us Godzilla. It's called The Mysterians. You can get it free on the net. And it has Japanese girls being abducted into flying saucers in their backyards. It has alien bases on the moon. And here's the weirdest thing. The aliens have actually built a base on Earth that's hidden. And when these scientists are out trying to investigate this strange stuff that's happened, it comes and rises out of the ground. And for just a second, it looks just like the Devil's Tower in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Just like it. And I know that Spielberg didn't make that. They said one of the movie people was working and they had a dream about the Devil's Tower. But that's a recurring symbol in things dealing with ETs, is this flat top mountain. And so it only appears for a second. But I was watching the movie and there's stuff going on that I don't understand. I'll also tell you, there's a passage from my novel where the Asian American heroine, she's the main heroine, is being forced by the UFO government to make a broadcast. Telling everybody, this is the way it is. Just follow orders. And she inserts a coded message in the speech. And everybody realizes she's doing this under duress and that they should attack now. And that same passage is in another novel that was written 5 years before that I never read. In fact, I thought it was called Mars Underground. It was written by a guy I know, and I thought it was about a scientific investigation of Mars. I didn't even know it was science fiction because they called the group that investigated Mars after the Vikings the Mars Underground because NASA lost interest in Mars. They said, we're not interested in Mars anymore. So this group called the Mars Underground formed, and I thought the book was about that. No, it was a science fiction novel. And it has the same Asian American journalist who's a damsel in distress being forced to make this broadcast or else they'll shoot her friends in the next room. And she puts this secret thing in, and I had that in my novel, and I'd never even read it. So some spooky stuff is going on here. This is larger than us. Yes?
Yeah, so just building off of her question, you've made some inferences to the government, like the collective government, and what they know. And in the context of this, I'm just curious, is the concern around the fact that we are not alone, or is it the fact of the devastating potential of nuclear weapons? Right? Could it be either? Or both?
I
Or just
don't
one or the
know.
other?
I don't know.
Right. But if forensically you do go to Mars,
Yes.
you cannot actually identify the intention of how weapon systems were used. You can just identify,
They were
forensically
used.
identify a signature that weapons were used.
Yes, that's
Not
all you can
who
do.
used it, or how it was?
Well, there might be hieroglyphic writings that we can interpret that tell the story of. The interesting thing about the faces, and this was noted very early, is that when you enhance them, they look very unfriendly. They look like they're glaring at somebody up in the sky. But I don't know. You know, you could be very well right. What are they covering up? That's the question.
But couldn't we see those also as their faces and they think they're beautiful?
Yes, that's very true. This could be very, you know, showing a smile for human beings could, you know, be viewed by some animals as a threat display. My cat, for instance, when I was growing up, I would smile at it and it would run and hide.
I have another question for you. So with this explosion, or what if can it be an impact?
No,
It could not be an impact?
it
And why
would have
is
left a
that?
big crater, and there's no craters. It's flat.
Okay, so then not an impact, but an explosion in space from something coming
Well,
toward
some
Mars?
people theorized it was caused by some kind of weird solar flare thing interacting with the Mars atmosphere because it has no magnetic field. There's some kind of solar flare hit. But it's full of thorium.
Right.
And solar flare would be just helium and hydrogen, basically. Thorium is very rare. Thorium is added to nuclear weapons to multiply the amount of neutrons they put out. They tested a nuclear weapon up in Amchatka, you all remember that, in Alaska. They found a nice earthquake fault and decided to test a nuclear weapon there. And it was to stop nuclear weapons in space. So they wanted as many neutrons as possible. So and it's been declassified that it was full of thorium, which normally you don't put in a hydrogen bomb. I'm not a hydrogen bomb expert. I never worked on them directly. They explained to us basically how they work because they were trying to recruit us. Why work on peaceful fusion, Brandenburg? We can give you fusion already out in Nevada. And yeah, but this is all very mysterious. I think we have to go up there, boots on the ground. You have to dig. And ask any archaeologist if he's investigating. You've got to dig. Archaeology sites are called digs. And you can't send a robot up there. You could drive robots around this area for years and not see anything. In fact, they've done it now. Oh, that's the other thing though. The joke is the rover drivers, they actually have guys and girls driving these rovers on Mars. And the joke is they recruit them from drivers in LA. You have to have driven a car in LA for at least 5 years to be a rover driver. Because if you spot a flaming car beside the road with somebody in a gorilla suit waving for help, you just keep driving. It doesn't matter what you see, you just keep driving. And they've spotted a lot of interesting things. But you notice they never go back and take another picture of them. They spotted the one thing that looks just like an Aztec Arctic. It's weird. The weird connection to me is all of the stuff looks like Aztec or Toltec, you know, old Mexico. And they found one thing that looked just like an Aztec idol, slightly worse for wear, and they got 2 pictures of it. Just look up Aztec idol on Mars. You'll find it on the net. They got 2 pictures of it, but they didn't stop. They just kept driving. Here's this thing, and it had flat teeth. It didn't have sharp teeth, it had flat teeth. It's very strange. But what was even stranger is they didn't stop to investigate. No, keep driving. Keep driving, Bill. But we keep driving. Yes.
I'm a little confused. If Mars is so radioactive, how would you land there and dig?
Well,
I mean, that's what
you
I'm-
must realize during the Cold War they developed sensors that were extremely sensitive. Those what I call hotspots on Mars, they're you know you wouldn't. There's more cosmic rays coming down from space than there is from these spots. But the thing is, they could pick up the gamma ray spectrum. They could identify the elements by the gamma ray energies. That's so.
I
That's
see.
but
That was my confusion.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No, you know, and the place to build settlements is mostly around the equator because it's warmer there. Of course, you'd like to make some things, and you know, there's plenty of water on Mars. All you just got to do is dig 5 feet, and there's water down there. They found craters on Mars that were formed recently, and they have blocks of ice thrown out. They even found a crater, and the Europeans released this, not NASA. A crater called Korolev. It's obviously a frozen lake. And NASA, you know, NASA's been photographing Mars for years. They've seen it, but they never released a picture. But the Europeans did. The nasty French. They're causing this problem. Yes. So, anyway,
I think there's one more question here.
oh yeah, please.
Do you have a theory on faster than light speed, just off the top?
Oh, well, because of Einstein's, in special relativity, space is flat and static. And that's where you get, believe it or not, when we were graduate students, they took us all aside. We were supposed to attend a lecture every week from some visiting scientist. And they would give us coffee and donuts. We liked that. We're graduate students, we need to eat. And then they would, but they gave a little speech, a 5-minute speech before the main lecturer, and it was by one of our professors. He says, there's been talk about warp drive and faster than light drives. If anyone asks you if that is possible, you say, no, it's against the law. And we're munching our donuts and looking at each other and thinking, why are they telling us this? And we realized, and we didn't even say the word UFO. We said, well, they don't want people thinking that people from other stars can visit us. That's why they're telling us this. It's against the law. But that's special relativity. General relativity, you can have Einstein-Rosen bridges connecting 2 parts of space-time, and you can fly down those, and you never exceed the local speed of light. You just found a shortcut because space-time is malleable. You can make tunnels through it. So that's how, and that's now been published by some eminent scientists, that you can make wormholes connecting 2 parts of space-time without violating the speed of light, because space-time itself can be warped. So once you control, if you're controlling gravity, by the way, with electromagnetism, bending it a little bit, that's anti-gravity. It gives you flight. Being able to twist space-time, not just bend it, but twist it into a pretzel, that's warp drive. If you can do one, you can do the other. That's what I think. That's what I think.
How?
Well, and I've published this, by the way. It's in the book Beyond Einstein's Unified Field Theory. And I didn't use any math. I just was hand-waving and diagrams. It uses Tesla fields, invented by Nikola Tesla, rotating electromagnetic fields. I called it a pointing vortex. And this coil is made of 3 parts, and what it does is it has rotating electromagnetic fields. And apparently that's the secret. And I didn't think that up originally. It was some people reported it in a scientific journal. I'll give you how strange this all gets. These 2 Japanese researchers, they reported that these things gyroscopes would lose a small amount of mass when they spun them counterclockwise, but not when they spun them clockwise. And then I found out a Russian paper had claimed the same thing. Same result. This was published in a big journal called Physiograph Letters, very eminent journal. The next month, they came out with a journal where people had supposedly, they said, we repeated the experiment of these Japanese guys. And the Japanese guys used electromagnetism to spin them things. The people said, we refuted their results. And they said, we used a compressed air gyro. Ran it on compressed air. And said, we ran it backwards and forwards. We didn't see anything. And I realized, they didn't repeat the experiment. It's the first thing you're supposed to do as a scientist if you're going to, you follow exactly what the people said that they did to see. So we got some money and repeated the experiment. We found the same result. Then we took out the rotors. It worked even better without the rotors. So that's just, I describe that in the book, Beyond Einstein's Unified Field, Gravity and Electromagnetism Redefined. So very good. I hope you guys, I'll make sure you guys get a copy of that for your library here. Well, thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience. You've been very patient.